2004 Vespa ET4, also known as the LX150, 150cc scooter. This belongs to a friend of mine, and she's the original owner of it. This is the first time I've ever worked on a Vespa scooter. In this video, I'll be replacing the speedometer cable, the brake line, and some miscellaneous switches, and also greasing the steering bearings. Before doing any repairs, I made sure that the scooter started and ran okay, which it did. I unscrewed the speedometer cable, which wasn't too difficult, and then I noticed that the front brake didn't work. The lever had pressure, it didn't go to the handlebar, but what it turned out to be was that the hose was either plugged or collapsed, and the dealer recommended I replace it. Looking over the paperwork and talking to my friend, I could see that she didn't ride the scooter very far. It had lots of periods of sitting around and had had very little maintenance ever done. The brake fluid had never been changed. The last oil change was done approximately 7 years ago, and that was probably the second oil change ever. So it did a lot of sitting with low miles. What you're going to see next is a bunch of still photos. Feel free to pause the video to look them over. And what I did is I downloaded the manual for free online. This is the shop manual, which is different than the owner's manual. It's more detailed. And using that, I looked at the location of various screws and things like that. And the most difficult piece, I think, to take off was the glove compartment box, that whole backing piece. Also, since the Vespa was new to me, I didn't realize that the metal in front is part of the body. It's welded on and it doesn't come off. So most scooters, you would just take that piece off. So here I have the diagram posted, and you can just look this stuff over and kind of see how I proceeded. Because the glove box is so difficult to remove without damaging the little key ring around the key, I recommend watching a separate video on that to get familiar with how you take it off and how you install it. Here you can see how I needed the torch to take the speedometer out of its housing there. You can see where I applied it. And these are the two gears. Here we have the order of the parts. That's the little inner part of the speedometer cable. I would recommend putting a little extra grease on there. Here I'm using an Allen socket with an extension on the ratchet, but it's probably better just to use the pipe. There's a lot of stuff to take apart when you got to replace either the speedometer cable or the brake line or both. Normally I don't like making so many different repairs at once, but in this case, once you take the plastic off and you take the glove compartment box out and the shock down, it just makes sense to go through and do everything. What you don't see in the video that I also replaced was several switches that had gone bad, like the horn, the signal light, that kind of thing. Here you can see you can get a socket on both of these nuts on the top of the shock, but you got to loosen the bottom and push it out of the way. Okay, so I just removed the speedometer cable. It was so hard because of the old grease, because this is a 2003 Vespa ET4. I took the torch and cautiously heat this area here for about maybe 30 seconds on low. That softened things up a lot, but I was able to pull the plastic part out, and the grease was so hard I had to pick it out. I used this little brush and I put the goof off, or you could use acetone, and I just scrubbed in and out. Then I'm going to pack it with this Mobile 1 grease, which won't harden up. And here's the old one. You can see the teeth are completely flat where it's seized. Even if the cable didn't go bad, this will just burn out from the grease. Now it's important to insert the cable and rotate the wheel and make sure everything turns okay. That the little
this pipe, I slipped over the number 6 Allen key because you can't get a straight shot with a ratchet and an extension. I recommend that you loosen this up, unscrew it by hand. Now finish this side here with the ratchet. The reason we're doing this is we loosen this up. That allows us to get a socket on the bolt. So here's the problem. This is the brake hose. There's not enough room to slip the speedometer cable in. Don't forget, as you're working, you can rotate the steering here, left or right, and disconnect the shock on the bottom. You can push it a little to the side. Then you have just enough room to get a socket on there to loosen that up. Like that. And you got to kind of work it out, and then it separates. Now we're going to push on this shock just a little bit like that, and I'll be able to get a socket up there and loosen this. Both these cables are going to get tucked into this bracket. I think it's brake cable first and then the speedometer cable, but they're both going to go through this little thing here. So now the shock is loose, right? And I had enough room without overdoing it or really forcing anything to slip this through. And don't forget, you can see it's stuck there, but I still have to get the little grommet has to slip through that hole too. That's why there's no way you're going to get that through, I think, without loosening the shock, because the grommet won't fit through. And that little grommet is going to go in this little clip right here. Now I've got plenty of room. I slipped the cable right through here. Next, I'm going to put it through here. I attached the speedometer. I did that to make sure the length is right. Now, I didn't take good pictures. I know these stripes have to line, and they're going to go under this thing here. I'm going to put a zip tie in there since this got broken. But this is a classic problem with all motorcycles. You get the cable runs. The book only shows you a rough run, but not exactly does it go under here, is on the outside. All your connections, you're going to want to take them off carefully and use some dielectric grease, which is basically a silicone-based grease, and that's what I've been doing on all these things. That way you can just wiggle them and they'll come right out, and it'll always be that way and they won't corrode. Unfortunately, I had to take the bolt off for the shock to get space because this was here, but the brake cable's supposed to go in the corner. It's very important to get those runs correct, or you may end up digging into the cable and shortening the life. So I'm going to just bring this around to get it on this side right here. Then I'm going to put the nut on and get a 14mm socket with an extension on that inner nut. Loosen that side, and you've got just that little bit of movement to get a socket on there. Now what I did is I put this nut on first and tightened it all the way up. Now I have more thread sticking out there, so it's going to be easier. I'm going to take the nut, put the washer on top, put my finger against it, and then I'm going to spin it like that to get it started. Plenty of thread showing, so it's going to be a lot easier to get a nut on there and get that started. Okay, what I just want to show you here is that by pushing that shock forward a little bit, you can get a socket on both of these. Right? It's a little hard to do this with one hand, but in the stills, there we go, right? And I can tighten that right up. And they actually, there you can see how we've got things rooted. And then we come down here. These two lines are going to be in between there. Just to catch up on things here. Now remember, the spindle is actually going to go inside the shock. So in the beginning, I thought, does the shock go in the front or in the back here? But it actually is going to sandwich the spindle here. It's basically graphite and makes it easy to screw in by hand. If I had this in back, this needs to go in the corner because it runs against the metal. And this is in the corner against the metal. This rubs against the rubber. I ran into some problems here. The clip got damaged, and this went down and straightened out the metal that got bent. I put it back in place. It tightened up beautifully. Getting ready to put the wheel on soon. A mistake I made, because this is my first time working on a Vespa, I took that grease cap and I put it in here. When I put the Mobil 1 synthetic grease in where the drive gear goes for the odometer, some of it got into here. One of the things, unfortunately, is where the grease had gone bad in the little drive for the odometer. They use the same grease everywhere, so everywhere has the same problem. Your spindle's going to bind up. And on this, the steering is very tight. I don't know if I can show you, but I can hardly move this thing. I can't even move it by hand. If I grab the steering here, it's very, very notchy and tight. See that? So in the steering bearings, same bad grease. So that's, after I get this other stuff together, I'm going to need to take this nut off, pull this off, and try to get some grease in there.
Okay, so next I put everything back together, and the most important thing is with that speedometer cable is to put your tire on, spin the tire by hand, you don't need to put the key in, and make sure that the speedometer needle moves. In my case it worked at first, and then later it did not work, and the problem turned out to be incorrect routing of the cable. Look at the picture you're looking at now, and now compare it to this picture. The speedometer cable is above the brake hose, but it actually should be running just below it and roughly parallel to it. It's important to remember, unlike a normal motorcycle where you could just pull on the cable to reposition it, you can't on the Vespa because it's locked in place by the top of the shock. You would have to loosen the top of the shock to get space in order to slide it up or down. The final repair is to add fresh grease to the steering bearings, which are binding so badly that the scooter's not safe to drive. It was surprisingly easy to remove the handlebars and drop the steering stem down a little ways and get fresh grease in there. Some important things are, it is critical that you mark the location of all parts. I used the paint marker, which you see in the picture, to do that. The locking rings can be loosened and tightened with a special tool called a hook wrench or a spanner wrench, but I used a punch on the upper one and a large pipe wrench on the bottom one, and it worked fine. Here's an overview of the steering bearing process here. There's our upper bearings. You see the alignment marks. That's the washers for the handlebars, just the proper order. Here's the lower steering bearing. You can see that it's completely dry and the race is actually rusted. Here's some of the tools I used, the pipe wrench, the silicone grease. This is how you remove and tighten the left mirror with a deep socket on the bottom. I've gotten questions about these two white dots, and what I did is I took those Allen bolts and filled them with silicone caulk. The only time they would be used is if you want to split the caliper to rebuild it. But to change the brakes, you do not loosen them. And so to prevent that from happening accidentally, either by myself or someone else, I cap them off. Here's a final look of what's inside the clamshell. After all this, I took a break and then cleaned the carburetor, and finally I did an oil change. The scooter's back up and running great.